Welcome back to the podcast, Nathan Hayes.
Hey, Steve. Good to be here.
It's good to have you here for the third or fourth time.
Something
You're
like that.
a early guest.
Yeah, when do I get a mug or something?
I'll work on that. We'll see if we got the budget for that. Um, Speaking of previous visits, last time we talked, I believe it was the last one we did. We covered the topic of what's my practice worth. If you want to know what your practice is worth, go back and look that one up. I believe that was the title. And we were talking earlier about building on that topic to ask a different question because the question of what's my practice worth is a great question to ask, but sometimes we ask it a little bit too late. Like we're going to sell the practice and we find out it's not quite worth as much as I hoped it would be. So we're asking a different question today, which is what can I be doing now to increase the value of my
Yeah.
practice in case I want to sell it, whether it's 5 years from now, 15 years from now, just making sure that you're doing the right things that are going to continue to add value over the years. So before we drill into specifics, I'm just going to hit you with a general question out of the
Mhm.
what would you say are the main things, the big rocks that owners should be focused on for a let's just say to keep the arrow pointing upward?
Yeah, I'll go a slightly different direction than sort of just driving the value of your business and maybe looking at two different questions that you should be working on. One is knowing what you're going to need in retirement. So, some people for lifestyle reasons and others are going to want their practice to be worth, 3, 5, $7 million to fund their retirement. Others don't have those same needs, maybe have permission not to push the practice hard. So one is go through the planning process of looking at the future, have a plan, know it'll change over time, but ask the question, what am I going to need when I get to the end point? How much am I saving now? What is my practice going to need to command at that point? Because that can drive both how you run it today and also you tell to and how you think about that. So that's one set of things that everyone can be working on earlier. The second one is probably more just curb appeal. So, I mean, a lot of people want to know, like, what's my practice worth? And really, the first question you answer is who's going to buy it and is anyone going to want it? And this really is the thing you can work on more than drill into this and then how it translates to revenues, profits, and valuation. Yes, just make the practice run well and run easily and be an enjoyable place for you to work and own it. Um, so thinking about, yes, all aspects of the business: team, delegation, process, accountability, um, infrastructure, and what's there. But thinking about, like, is this going to be a desirable practice for someone else to own, whether it's another OD or an associate, whether it's a private equity group, whether it's a pathology group, who's going to want to buy this and what are they getting out of it? Kind of working on those questions and then asking, like, hey, if it's fun for me to work here and I enjoy running this business, it's going to be attractive to somebody else.
It's a great point you started with about getting clear on what the end goal is, what the needs are, because we could be doing all the right things to increase value of the practice, but then you get to a point where you're ready to sell and you realize you don't have enough in retirement to support the kind of lifestyle. Do you find that do a lot of doctors have a financial advisor? I knew you were going to laugh when I said that. If the answer is no, I mean, what should they be doing? That I assume the obvious answer is here is find one. Start working with somebody who can help you at least start to plan out what things might look like. So you're not caught at the point of retirement realizing, oh, I need to work another 5 years.
Yeah, I don't know that many have done true planning or even have, not just maybe even just an investment advisor versus a financial advisor. Um, Certainly when so full disclosure for the listeners, my twin sister is a financial advisor who does work in the space. And I remember when she was coming in, I called a mutual friend of ours in iDocs, Adam Schmela, who also has a financial advisory firm, and said, "Hey, you need to know, like, I love working with you. My sister's coming in this space." And he very graciously said, "Look, it's a blue ocean. The more people we have doing this, the more we normalize this for optometrists, the better." And that's been true. So I think fewer than you'd hope have financial advisors. And I'd say, a couple of things you're looking for is certainly you want someone who's fee based and not commission based, so they're not incentivized to sell you a bunch of stuff that you may or may not need. Those fees are either a flat rate or going to be charged as like a percentage of the assets they're managing for you. Um, and the second one is really get into like, what is your planning process with, helping me determine what I'm going to need, and then looking at the process there. And I'll say like, there's two ways this cuts. I mean, one is the sort of the one you'd think about, which is, hey, I mean, I've had people call me like, I want to retire at 55, and you've got a $700,000 practice that's going to be worth $450,000. Like, how far do you think that's going to take you for, 45 years more of life if you want to plan out to 100, which is kind of the prudent way to do it in most cases. Um, it just doesn't go very far. So yes, there's a lot of cases where someone hasn't asked the question, hasn't thought about it, and didn't really think like, oh, I'm going to need to have 2 million saved or accumulated by the time I get there, or 3 million or 4 million to really sustain my lifestyle. That's one set of questions. But on the other side of the pendulum, if you will, there are owners that just kind of run scared their whole career and just grow, and suddenly wake up with a 4-location group across state lines with 50 staff, stressed out always, and never ask like, hey, how much income was enough to meet my long-term goals? And actually, if I don't want to grow my business further, am I on pace to get what I need? A wife once called me and said, can you talk my husband off the ledge? He has these grand goals, and I'd like to spend time with him. And I kind of called him. He's had this vision of having like 5 locations. And I said, look, what do you need to retire? And they knew that their number was $10 million, which is a big number. Okay, great. Awesome. You know your number. How much are you on pace to save? 7 million. Okay. And your 2 offices, I can tell you today, are probably worth about 3. So why do we want to get more complex and bigger? There comes a point where maybe you just get bored and you want to stretch yourself. But sometimes I think owners, more often than not, either are really not thinking about how much they're going to need, but sometimes they don't ask how much I need and say, is what I have today enough to meet my needs? Do I really want to make things bigger, more complex, and harder?
We've joked before about our job as part life coaching.
Mhm.
So and that sounds like one of those instances.
It's true.
You bring up some good points there about mistakes that owners make to sort of, and this may be something they do later on in the life cycle of a practice, realizing that maybe it's not worth as much as they hoped it was, to try to inflate the value, sort of artificially inflate the value, but that might actually work against them when it comes time to sell.
Yeah, I think again, the bigger issue with most practices is going to be just finding someone who's interested. It's tough when you get to the end of the road and having to like stretch for a number. You can try to sort of cut expenses dramatically, but if I'm looking at P&L and I see, cost of goods drop 10% year over year, 20% year over year, I'm going to start asking questions about what you're doing to inflate it. And the other thing too is you can try to mess with your financials. That's a little harder. You can ask whatever you want for your business. And what I found more often than not is generally like the stronger a practice is, the less an owner thinks it's worth. And then sort of the weaker it is, the more an owner wants to ask for, at least. I mean, maybe they don't even think it's worth that much. But yeah, and some of this is going to depend on buyers too, because you do have multiple different sort of values for businesses who's buying it. Private equities, one rate, right? Private equities are more in traditional ranges. You got ophthalmology, and it's kind of all over the some different specialty private equity groups that may come in a little different. But it's tough late in the game when you haven't done the planning and you haven't at least gotten some advice on what your practice commands to go where it is. And really finding buyers is the bigger deal, because I barely heard of it, more and more owners that just close their practices because they can't find a buyer. In some ways, regardless of the health of the business. Yes, you can try, but I mean, at some level, your buyer is going to have an acid test of how much income do I expect to earn from this business if I'm the owner. And maybe that's day one, and maybe it's even looking ahead and saying, once I make some improvements, what is it going to look like? What's it going to cost to own it? And usually you're looking at what's amortized cost. So think about loan payments to the bank or financing terms. And just for those who want to kind of plug in, right now, banks are offering 100% financing, so no down payments, Usually a 10-year term, call it 6.5% interest. That term might go to 12 or 15 years in some. You can kind of ask, like, what's the payments, what's the cash flow going to be after payments? And that's where if there's no profits there, you support the note and then pay enough to a future. It doesn't really matter what you ask. The practice just doesn't support the price. And again, there's some buyers that are willing to take more risk on, hey, this is kind of a project and a fixer-upper, and I'll still pay you something for it. Until you get multiple buyers, it's hard to think it's going to get bid up or command more than its cash flow really supports in most cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. And you've got almost two ends of the spectrum here. You've got the practices that there's some concern that they might not be able to sell. Maybe they just haven't grown, that the doctor hasn't maybe put in the work over the years to continue building the value. And now it's at a point where maybe there's not many or any buyers there. But on the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned private equity, and I want to talk about that for a second, because there's a mix. People feel differently about that. Some people say, well, I don't want to sell to private equity for their own reasons, and others see it as an attractive option financially. And I think you got to do what's best for you and your family. What is private equity looking for? For that doctor who's saying, you know what, I got maybe 5 years, whatever it is, whatever my timeline is. And I think in my case, private equity might be the best option for me. Do you have any insight into what they're looking for?
Well, you certainly can either reach out to a broker or reach out to them directly and say, would you be interested? Very roughly, and there's some variation group to group. Here, you're usually looking for at least a minimum of $1 million in revenue collected on the business, in probably some proximity to a larger area that they're already investing in. So if you're in the middle of nowhere, less likely to be interested in your practice. It's have to think about what their risk factors are, because they're not ODs going to work in your practice. Like, they're going to want it to be close enough up center where when you retire, they can replace you for patient care. Because if they buy your practice and you stay for 3 years and retire and there's no one left, like, what have they got exactly at that point? So that's some of the considerations. Scale is there. And certainly, once you push into multi-millions, you're going to be more attractive. But usually a baseline of $1 million before they're really interested. That might relax a little bit in some cases, but not often.
The point of a buyer looking at the OD and saying, can we replace you? And you use the example of being in a location where there's other doctors there that they could eventually replace. But it's also an interesting conversation, because we've heard a lot of doctors say, my patients only want to see me, which is probably not the best tagline when you're looking to sell your practice.
Also, not really good for your practice or you in a lot of cases.
And I've heard you say that before to doctors, that we want to look at this through the filter of a potential buyer. They're not going to want to walk into a practice that does depend on that owner. So typically we do like to see a situation where there's some systems in place and it's not completely dependent on the owner. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And, what steps can a seller be taking leading up to a potential sale so the practice is not completely dependent on them, which can work against them?
And just to come to the question, but I want to make a point so we don't have to belabor it. The best way to increase the value of your business, and fundamentally the only way to do it, is to increase the revenues, profits, and cash flows of the business. Okay, but revenue, profit, and cash flow is downstream of a lot of other activities, and marketing and management and stuff. So let's talk about what sort of some buckets to think about managing your practice. And when someone's buying a business, and the reason they pay more than just the value of the equipment is they're buying more than just the equipment of practice. Just $1.5 million in revenue, sells for $1 million. The underlying assets of that business maybe are $200,000 worth of equipment with some depreciation tagged onto that. So you're really not buying the infrastructure so much as what else are you buying? You're buying the brand and the reputation of the practice. You're buying the patient base, the customer base. You're buying the people, in a weird sense, but the knowledge within that practice. And you are buying the infrastructure, the equipment, the processes and stuff. So if you want to think about managing your business well, it's really making sure those 4 areas are kept up and sustainable so someone else can step into your shoes and expect to enjoy the same revenues and profits and growth potential going forward. and really for owners, as you get closer to your retirement date, thinking about getting yourself out of that loop is really important. And that's really what is your patient care responsibility, and how do you answer for that over time? And then what is your management responsibility, and how do you answer for that? Especially if you have a spouse that manages the practice, you need to sort of answer for both, because chances are your spouse isn't going to manage for somebody else. Um, but those hats, and then even looking at your team and asking, okay, do I have a key manager or a bunch of employees that expect to retire when I do? That's going to become a risk for your future buyer. Or do we have them trained up to where, hey, this buyer can step in. They don't have to know everything because my team knows how to run it. They just have to learn it and see patients. Same for equipment. Again, like, do you want to buy everything under the sun? Not necessarily, but do you want to make sure that it's reasonably up to date and kept up? Yes. And your physical space, is it kept up? Do you have procedures so that when someone new comes on, if they're having to replace people, that there's a documented procedure, whether it's written or maybe you did some video training stuff with Leo or some other tools? It's those things where just think about, can someone step in and can they learn my job quickly and expect for this thing to keep running when I'm gone?
You and I were a couple of years ago. We were at New England College of Optometry. I think it was day 2. They had the students talk. They had a student panel, and something that came out loud and clear was their desire for work-life balance. This is a young generation, which is fine, but I think it's important to be mindful of that. If you are looking at selling the practice, and especially to somebody maybe coming out of school or somebody who's younger, having systems in place where it's the practice is not dependent on you. Now, if you got somebody who comes in is like, I love patient care, I want to see patients 6 days a week, great. They probably have the option to do that. But also, I don't think that's going to be very attractive if they come into that situation to assess your practice and the doctor says, I have to work 6 days a week. This thing depends on me, because that
Yeah.
might not be attractive, especially to the younger generation of ODs.
Yeah. We had a case where it was a partnership, and the senior partner just didn't really know what else to do with his time. So he spent like 3 days in management a week in the office. Then they wanted to own a practice that was looking at his role, and in the end left and started cold because she was totally intimidated by the amount of time he had to spend in management. And I think most other, if you want to spend time, great, knock yourself out. But just keep in mind, like, does it really need you running it that much? Maybe, but think about how that looks to an associate. I'm part of a program at Southern College every year where we bring back recent-ish grads that have gone into ownership to tell their stories to the third years before they go on externship. And one year they were wrapping up, and all 3 of the practice owners were saying that, yeah, if you get in there, you just want to work really, really hard, you'll be fine. And knowing that exact thing we're talking about, that desire for work-life balance, I kind of pause them for a second and say, okay, I will accept that when you guys took over your businesses, whether you started cold or whether you bought it out or whether you stepped into partnership, that's kind of how we allocate the winners. You probably had some 60 hours a week while you got your arms around the business. Fine. 80-hour weeks. Right now, how much time do you spend in admin time and management time on your practice every week? And the average answer was 4 hours. I wanted the students to hear that, to know that, hey, look, yes, there will be times if you own a business where you're accountable, you've got to lean in and just work and grind. But if it's set up right, put in your patient care hours, make sure you're managing the team well, and then let it run and get out of the way. And the better you can do at building systems, processes, accountability, the easier it's going to be to step away. We have an IDOC member who recently went through a process of really the entrepreneurial operating system into her practice. The big thing she started doing, 2 hours a week of meetings with her team, her management team, and her staff, and not a big practice. And before it even impacted the financials, so like revenue started to grow and profit started to grow, the thing she said was, I can sleep at night because I know everyone's on the same page. And some of it's just, how do you create a worry-free practice where you know everyone's pointed in the same direction? This is taking time out of patient care, maybe even out of like sort of small things, bookkeeping or setting the staff schedules. Work on the higher level things that let your team perform when you're not there.
So we've seen a lot of transition in years as practices, intentionally or otherwise, like somewhat sort of migrated away from a focus on optical into medical care specialty. That seems to be where practices are shifting some of their interests. And I'm just curious, as a lot of practices, in many practices, if not most, the optical is still the profit engine for most practices. I'm just curious, as practices decide where they're going to put their efforts, it could that hurt the value of a practice if you're where are we at in terms of the medical and the specialty? Is what I'm trying to ask in terms of valuing a practice and continue to grow it.
Yeah, I think s- there's two aspects to it. One is certainly if like you're giving up a revenue source, you're going to eat into your profitability. And yeah, you decide to not sell glasses anymore and just focus on medical, you better really fill the schedule and offset that, because it's not like, hey, we don't have materials cost tied to these visits, therefore they're more profitable. Mm. We will need more staff and a more medically oriented practice. And unless something's really off in your mix of revenues, it doesn't really make sense. So one of the ideas when we think about customer base and is to think like, what's your revenue sources? And the more narrowly you concentrate your revenue sources or customers, the bigger the risk is in the business, which in theory affects the multiplier. I don't think far in an eye care valuation, but more diversified sources of revenue, I just think is better. So stay full scope unless there's a really good reason. I mean, there's some, the only things I can think of is like if you have a specialty peds practice where you want referrals from other, like a VT practice, and you want referrals from other private optometry practices, maybe you shut down your opticals so you're not competing with them. But that's a very narrow niche versus just saying, oh, this is hard and we don't capture as much, so we'll just wave the white flag. I understand the impulse, but I don't know that it's the wisest thing.
That's how I'd look at it. I think is is the add-on component, right? Is you have the optical, but then also having the additional services added on to that. I think is still probably the wisest approach financially.
Yes.
And then I have one more question for you, and I'm going to bring it full circle to where we started. You mentioned the word curb appeal,
Mhm.
and so what should doctors be doing in terms of that? We're going right now, my wife and I have been having a discussion about the carpet upstairs, and she's admittedly it needs to be replaced. I think it's the original carpet. We kind of been putting it off, and according to her, the house isn't going to sell with the old carpet in there. And so, guess who just spent a bunch of money on a brand new carpet? We did. So, in terms of curb appeal in a practice, there's a lot of outdated practices out there, and quite frankly, there's a lot of just cookie cutter practices too. But how do you keep up with that? Is that something you would just budget in yearly for upgrades, for new furniture, new designs to make sure that when you go to sell it, it does have that curb appeal?
Yeah, I mean, so curb appeal I'll take in two directions. One is sort of the bones of the practice. Mm. Is someone gonna have to replace all the equipment? Is it equipped fully for what a future owner will want to do? Is the physical space kept up? But that's paint, carpets type stuff, which is really not that expensive, all things considered. I know $20,000 in their personal finance is a lot of money. On a $2 million practice, it's 0.1% of revenues, or 1% of revenues. It's just not that much. 1%. Sorry, it's just not that much in the grand scheme to outlay. So yeah, you should maybe have a little reserve fund for upkeep. And the other piece of curb appeal again comes down to owner's time and responsibilities, and like, can I see myself succeeding here? Mm. You'd asked earlier about like tricks people play on the valuation, and I'll just say a small practice that so it has an optometric net of 45-50% of revenues. It usually says to me, we haven't spent a dime keeping this up or keeping our staff up. And so, like, yeah, it looks super profitable, but I don't know it's going to have curb appeal because it's unnaturally profitable for what's there. Sometimes, if you're in a very small town area where rents are low, labor costs are low, that can be just reality. But more often than not, it's a sign that we haven't spent enough. So I think it's keeping it up enough. I will say that as you get closer, sometimes you just want to like let it be in the price and let the next owner decide. So, um, let's say that you haven't ever had EHR, gone to computers on your records. you may just let the next owner implement that and pick the system they want rather than guessing which system your owner is going to want. And the same for some things, if you know that, hey, our OCT is on its last legs, maybe just let the owner decide which one they want and know it falls into the price. Um, when you're selling your house and you kind of want to keep it neutral, but sometimes like, hey, do we want to let this future buyer decide what kind of carpet they want upstairs or not? So just be aware of that sort of tension there. But it's the sort of thing where if you haven't been keeping up with it, you probably just going to end up eating at the price. And if you have, it should be fine. It's the basic stuff, though. I mean, I shouldn't go to your office that I was in a couple of years, and just looking around is like paint's chipping, and you just kind of again, I'm kind of looking for it, but you notice and tired. So I hope that answers it. You don't need to spend tons of money keeping it up, but I think just staying up with both your team, your processes, your software, your physical space, your equipment. If you spread it out over time, it's usually not going to way. But if someone comes in and knows I'm going to have to replace half the instruments, that's going to affect certainly how they price the practice. How
Yeah, and I think comes back to the same as a house. It comes back to that first impression when somebody walks. And to my wife, she's right in this case. So you want to make a good first impression, both with the the facility and the equipment, and not give that appearance of outdated and there's stains on the carpet and all of that. So
having bought and sold a house this year, I can confirm that actually keeping it up matters more because we had done some stuff along the way. We didn't do much at all to sell because we kept everything else. New house. We redid the entire kitchen because it was just. But
well, Nathan, thank you so much as always.
It's my pleasure. Always good to talk to you. And this is one where the value. One last sort of note on the process stuff. When you get the process stuff right of your infrastructure, your people, your processes, your brand and marketing, that will generally translate to more patients wanting to be seen, revenue going up, profits increasing. So, it's easy to think like, hey, let's just stare at our P&L. Like, no, let's work on the running of the business day to day. And owners, the less that you're necessary for the day to day, the more headspace you're going to have to make decisions and see opportunities to grow your business. So, yes, this is about a curb appeal of not looking like you're overwhelmed by running your practice, but actually getting yourself out of it will open up the headspace and emotional bandwidth and time to actually drive it forward to the next level of growth if you want to go there.
Yeah, and it's great things to think about. Start thinking about today that puts you on a path to, again, just the theme of this episode is continue to build the value. So ultimately, you don't get to a point where you're ready to sell and realizing that you haven't done the things that you probably should have. So thanks again. As always, thanks for your insights.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Well, thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And we will see you in the next episode.